Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Molly Anderson, Executive Director of UB Center for Leadership and Organizational Effectiveness, and I'd like to welcome you to our series, 52 Weeks of Leadership. I want to thank GEICO for making it possible for us to provide this series, all 52 weeks, to people all over the world. So thank you, GEICO. Next, I'd like to tell you about our Chloe Conference on June 3rd. We're going to be featuring 25 of our faculty, staff, experts and scholars around the future of leadership, changing the way we live and work. And we're going to have special keynote speaker from Daniel Pink, the author of Drive, The Surprising Truth About What Motivates Us. But now the reason we're all here today, and that's to hear from one of our very own in the School of Management, Dr. Prasad Balkhandi. He is a PhD and chair of our Organization and Human Resource Department in the School of Management at the University of Buffalo. His research interests around social networks and his teaching in organizational behavior. So here he is to talk about negative relationships. Join me in welcoming Prasad Balkhandi.
Well, good morning, good afternoon. And I know some of you have come all the way from India and Ghana, so good evening to all of you. I want to talk to you today about the role of negative ties. And I thought, let me start with none other than the Godfather here, Al Pacino, who made a statement: a man's stature is determined by his enemies and not just his friends. Can you folks hear me clearly?
Yes, Prasad. Very good.
Thank you. All right. So when we talk about negative relationships, I'm going to take a very different perspective than what one would typically expect. I'm going to take a perspective that comes from a very well-researched area called social network analysis. But before I go there, I just want to be clear about the definition. Here is one of the most hated men in the United States. Anybody wants to type in the chat function who this person is? I can see the chat function. This is Martin Shkreli. No, Michelle, I'm sorry. That's right, Peter, thank you. The Pharma Bro, that's right, Stephen. So you got Pharma Bro here. He basically took a pill that costed $13 and made it $750, okay? And so it turns out that this individual got the reputation, at least on the internet, as being one of the most disliked persons. And so let's try to sort of unpack a little bit about what we know about such individuals. So the literature on negative relationships has been around for a while. From the academic standpoint, the one book that has made a huge impact has been this book here called The No A-Hole Rule. I'm sorry, my kids are at home and I'm running this from home, so I'm going to stick to PG language. So I'm going to sort of tell you that one of the things that we're going to quickly uncover is who are these individuals like Martin Shkreli? Where do they come from? Like, what is their personality basis? And how do we recognize these type of individuals? We'll run a quick poll. Dorothy, can you just run the quick poll a little bit to sort of get us on the same page? Yeah. So there are two simple questions for you to answer. All right, 30 more seconds, and then I'm going to end this poll to sort of get your input. Great, great, great. I'm seeing the responses. I don't want to share the responses yet. Okay, yeah, we will end the polling, Dorothy. We won't share the results yet, but we'll end it for now. Okay. So let me get into a little bit into the first question: where do jerks come from? In order for us to understand where jerks come from, we need to go back and look at your personality. Okay. anybody's personality. And the one model that has been empirically validated in different cultures and over several decades has been called the Big Five personality model, or it's called the Oceans model. Peter, can you add in the chat function the web link so that you can fill this assessment out? You don't have, please don't do it right now. It's going to take a little bit of time. It's a free online survey. You can fill it out on your own. And so these are the 5 dimensions that will emerge when you fill this survey out. The first one is openness to experience. That is how open you are to new ideas. It really gets at creativity. Conscientiousness is your attention to detail, how hardworking you are. Third one is extroverted. That is, to what extent are you gregarious? The 2 personality dimensions that are associated with negative types are agreeableness and neuroticism. And I'm going to delve a little bit into it, but from a perspective of who is a jerk, typically individuals who score low on agreeableness typically emerge as jerks. And the reason is, for them, getting along with others is not important. They tend to be very competitive, tough-minded, and very analytical. Whereas individuals who score high on this personality model tend to be more trusting, and they're actually vulnerable to the idea of impressing others. So they will go out of their way to impress others. So it turns out that individuals who score low on agreeableness are the ones who typically are seen as jerks by others. Now, when you do the survey, you may turn out that you may end up being on either end of the continuum. So there are a few suggestions on what you can do if you scored low on this. And by the way, I will put up these slides in a PDF format, so you'll have it. First is, if you scored low on this, be open to the idea of seeking feedback. And also, because you really one doesn't have much empathy when one is low on agreeableness, it's really important to learn how to be an active listener. So these are some ways you can actually think about where jerks come from. And here is what we do know about jerks. So this is what we call as a network diagram. So what we do is, typically we give a list of everybody in the organization, and we tell them who do you dislike or who do you avoid. So this was a dislike network, and this is a quite well-developed dislike network, okay? But when you look at this network, there are a few interesting things that surface. So for example, take a look at this one person here. This person is really disliked by quite a few others. And then you can also think about these 3 people here. This is like the dislike cluster, the dislike triad, because quite a few people around the network are disliked by these people, okay? Now, here is the part we come back to when we look at disliked individuals. So at this stage, I'm going to share the survey, the poll results with you, okay? I'm going to go to question 1. Okay, can you folks see this, the poll results?
Yes, thank you.
Yes.
Great, thank you. So the first question was, if I had 100 friends, how many would call you a friend? You're absolutely right. The majority said around half of them. Actually, it's even less than that. It's around 40%. So think about it. And by the way, the number 100 actually is in any week, you tend to interact with around 150 people. It's called the Dunbar number. And it turns out that, I'm just exaggerating here, but what we call as reciprocity, that if I had 100 friends, really only 40% of them would reciprocate these ties. Now, when you came to the next one, out of your 100 contacts, how many of them would dislike you? This is the Dunbar number. You're absolutely right. Around 7% dislike you, and that is normal. However, if you scored low on agreeableness, your number will be higher, right? And I'm also going to tell you one more personality trait that is associated with these negative relationships. So what happens, we're now sort of going to come back to the survey results. We're going to go beyond the survey results at this stage. When an individual is a jerk, such as Martin, it turns out that people withhold information from them, and they even may be sabotaging them. And so we do know, based on a meta-analysis that we just completed, where we summarized over 150 primary studies, what we found was that jerks typically underperform. But here is a paradox. The paradox is that many times people are not really accurate about who dislikes them and how many friends they have. So what ends up happening is that when you look at whether these people are happy or not, it turns out that these jerks actually are just as happy as this man smiling on my side, right? And if you looked at his behavior during the congressional hearings, he had no clue how much he was upsetting other people. So the point here is that jerks typically have no idea about how much they are disliked. And if you actually measure their job satisfaction scores, they actually are very happy. Now, the question that we don't know is if they are made aware that they are hated, what happens to their job satisfaction? That we don't know. And I don't think our human subjects review boards would actually allow us to test such a question. But we do know this, that jerks underperform, and it's because other people withhold information. You know, for every Batman, there is a Joker, and for every coin, there has to be the other side of it. So the same thing happens with jerks. If you have a jerk, then there obviously are going to be haters, right? And I'm dramatizing it here, okay? But I'm basically using the word hater, or somebody who has this propensity to dislike others. And so when we look at this slide, it's the same network of peers who sort of marked themselves, each other, as individuals they disliked. And I told you that you had this triad of dislikes, that, you know, consistently people dislike these three people, and these two individuals are also disliked. But when you flip the coin and you look at the haters, it is this individual here. That is, they tend to send out all these negative relationships. The paradox is this. This is the hater here. And when you look, they're not actually seen as a jerk. They do have at least a few incoming ties, but not as pronounced as the number of ties that they send out. So we typically forget this. When we think about negative relationships, we tend to only think about the jerks. And what I want to bring back to your attention is that the haters actually are doing themselves the biggest disservice. So who are these haters, and where do they come from, and how to recognize a hater? So again, I'm coming back to this personality model that I told you, the big five. When you fill it out online, it's either called neuroticism or emotional stability, okay? It's worded either way. Neuroticism is worded negatively. Emotional stability is worded positively. So the idea is, if you scored high on neuroticism, you tend to unable to process negative information. So you tend to be highly anxious, irritable, moody, lower self-esteem, and very sensitive to stress. Now, I must say that COVID has made all of us a little bit more neurotic. So don't be surprised if you scored a little bit on the neurotic side. So the solution that everybody has been talking about from a wellness perspective holds true for all of us at this time, whether it is self-care, whether it is meditation, exercise, the same things hold true. Whereas individuals who score low on neuroticism tend to be calm, patient, they tend to be even-tempered, and they tend to be really cool. and they can sort of very clearly make distinctions with others. So how do you handle this? If you scored high on neuroticism, you got to manage stress, and you got to really be open to feedback. So that is an important aspect about neuroticism. That is, these individuals are highly stressed out, but at the same time, they tend not to be open to feedback. And so they get stuck in this loop. And even when they're given feedback, they end up really reacting in a negative way, which sort of re-triggers the loop. So you got to be a little bit wary of that. And so if you are interacting with someone who's neurotic, you really want to think through how you are giving that feedback and how it's going to be taken. All right, so what happens to the haters? A few interesting things, actually. And it's all self-defeating. Because this individual, as I showed you back here, they decided to avoid all these other people around them. So, and it could turn out that these contacts had some important information for them, but they decided not to go there, right? So they sort of self-defeated themselves. So the idea was that they withhold themselves from others who actually are not even aware that they're being avoided by these other people, right? From a job attitudes, again, self-defeating. Basically, it's this: they are punching themselves in the face. Because they withhold information, withhold seeking out information from others, the underlying premise is they are unhappy about their job. They don't like their colleagues, they don't like what they're doing, the world for them is really dark, and so they end up undermining themselves. So my point to you is, after you're done with this talk, I would suggest go and do the Big Five, the link that we have provided in the chat function, and then see how you score on these two dimensions, agreeableness and neuroticism. And let us say you end up scoring high on agreeableness, low on neuroticism. Most probably you are not either a jerk or a hater. So you get away on this issue. However, if you score low on agreeableness and high on neuroticism, right? That means most probably other people are going to mark you like that person. Okay, so I want you to take this feedback. And if you have any questions, you can always email me on this issue. But I'm sort of moving forward to take it to the next step. And this aspect is something that's been coming up more recently in our research. And that is the role of ties in teams. And so when we think about teams and ties, you can think about the ties that one has inside the team and that ties have outside the team. And then I want to sort of capture the last missing puzzle, which is central to all these 52 weeks of talks, and that is leadership style. So here is a typical network survey that I give in organizations. So this was actually a bunch of executives taking a course, and I asked them who do they go to for advice, and I clustered them by color. So this was one team, and you're able to see everyone is seeking advice from everyone else. But if you look down here, one tie is missing down here. You also look here, there's a tie that's missing. So the missing of positive ties does indicate a potential for a negative relationship. Okay. Now, the reason why it's important to have a positive relationship in a team is people interact with each other, they get a shared understanding of each other's strengths and weaknesses, and that is why it leads to greater team performance. So we call that as team transactive memory. It's the strongest predictor of team performance. Okay. So, but here is the weird part. When you look at the negative relationship, so I asked this group who they avoid. Here is the thing. There was actually a negative tie within the team members. So that meant this individual did not go to advice or friendship, and therefore that leads to lower team transactive memory. And most probably, if we ask this person, will you come back to this group? They'll say no. And so one of the things that's unique about teams is that our members willing to stay back and contribute to the team. So we call that as team viability. And we see that this team is not as viable as my favorite team here because everybody is cohesive. However, my favorite team too has a problem. Do you see the problem here? And the problem is they're disliked by people in each of the other teams. Actually, it turned out that this was the highest performing team. So they had, either these people were jealous of them or whatever it is. The net result is that if this team ran into a problem that needed some information, some skill set that was not available within them, then they would find it difficult. So what I'm trying to get to you is that we want to think about negative ties inside and outside the team, right? And so what is the one way to address negative ties? And most recently, Dean Paul Teslak and I, we published a paper looking at leadership style. And the leadership style we focused on was humility. And what we found was if you had a leader who was forgiving, who was empathetic, who had a growth mindset, they were likely to develop a team which had very few negative ties, okay? And in fact, they were able to have more number of positive ties. And both of these then led to higher team performance. And as I mentioned, team viability. That is, people are willing to remain in that team and contribute, okay? So at this stage, I want to sort of tell you that you can even take the negative tie metaphor to the higher level, where you can think about negative ties between countries and organizations and the implications this has between information and trade between these different entities. And it sort of actually just primarily mirrors what happens in an organization. So that is one of the beauties of the network approach, that you can actually look at these issues. Now, one question I've had very frequently is, okay, let's say we find a jerk, right? Let's say we found Martin Shkreli. Should we fire him, right? And the answer to that is not as simple as it looks. There's a very interesting anecdote behind this. And that is, it turned out that a researcher did a survey as a consultant, not as a researcher. They did a survey and they found that there was a Martin Shkreli in that organization. And everybody agreed that this person was a jerk. And they said, okay, we want to fire this person. And they did fire the person. And next day, they lost their biggest client because this individual had that one connection outside that no one had perceived. So remember, when we ran that poll, I asked you how, basically what I was getting at is how accurate are we in understanding the relationships around us? And actually, some of us are good. Some of us actually are pretty good at identifying who's friends with who dislikes who, right? But typically, most of us are inaccurate. And that inaccuracy then comes back to sort of haunt us. And that's what ended up haunting this organization. So I thought, let me end today's talk by going back to Don Corleone. I started with Al Pacino, but I thought, let me end it with Marlon Brando saying, never hate your enemies. It affects your judgment. Absolutely. Right? You want to be really careful. What this literature says is that if you choose to be a hater, then it comes with a price. So if you are scoring, if you know someone who's scoring very high on neuroticism, then the person who is undermining them is the person in the mirror, right? And again, Godfather's recommendation is this: forgive, forget. Life is full of misfortunes. That is, already life is tough. And I think COVID has made that point very clearly. You don't need to add to it by denying others or putting them in the doghouse when they don't even know that. All right. So with that, I would like to end today's talk. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, you can email me or please feel free to put in the chat function.
Thank you so much, Prasad, and we'll give everyone a moment to add their questions or comments to the chat. In the meantime, I wanted to let everybody know that on April 5th, next Monday, we're going to be featuring Courtney Walsh, who's Assistant Dean of Executive and Professional Development in the School of Management. And her topic is going to be what leaders need to know about the future of work. So you don't want to miss that next Monday at noon. Okay, let's see. We have a question from Anthony Villani. With the story of the jerk holding the big client connection, how might an organization deal with the limited ability which brings value and best deal with it?
Okay, Anthony, here I'm going to make a marketing pitch to you, for you, saying that when an organization realizes that there is a jerk in town, that's a time for them really to have an executive coach, right? And I know one specific incident where an organization did have this issue, and what they chose to do was they actually isolated this person into a different physical location so that they would not interact with the rest of the organization. And then they paid a broker to manage the relationship with the rest of the organization, right? So typically, jerks can be high performers. We do know that. So the paradox that organizations have to grapple with is, do we want to let them go? Or do we draw on their positives, yet not let them be that toxic person who spoils the culture? And so this organization basically put their best employee in the basement with the best office space, with the toughest secretary to manage the show. And that way the client still kept coming to this employee and the organization was fine. And then I'm going to make a pitch for executive coaching. And just as an idea, we do have a course on this. It was unintentional, but as I've gone through the course myself, I've sort of realized that it made a lot of sense. Okay.
Thank you, Prasad. Thanks for giving a pitch to our leadership coaching certification program. We're recruiting our next cohort for this fall, and Dr. Bakhandi is one of our participants. There's a comment from Sunil. This becomes tough in startups. Firing a valuable, high-performing jerk is hard with resources being limited. Would you care to comment on that?
It is true, Sunil. And by the way, thank you very much for coming in from North Carolina. So Sunil actually used to be here in Buffalo. And so, yeah, it is a tough issue. And I think that's where with startups, it could be that that's one of the reasons why startups do have such a high failure rate. And I think that's the reason why executive coaching at startup rates may be a bigger value than mainstream organizations. Okay. Especially in these type of scenarios where you don't have choices, you'll have to manage them in more innovative ways, right? Okay.
Well, thank you. Erin Kelly summed it up really well. She said, perfect combination of authentic, funny, erudite, and useful. So Prasad, thank you on behalf of Chloe and all of us for a great afternoon. Everyone have a great week. We'll see you next Monday.
Yeah, great. Thank you.